We're on. Okay. Hi, everyone. I'm Sonia, and I'm here with Bill Schroder. Bill is a special counsel at Sullivan and Cromwell, and he teaches public international law, international court advocacy, transnational litigation, and dispute resolution at the Rutgers School of Law in New York. He has also been heavily involved in our nonprofit world, especially locally. He is an advisor to the board at Camp Friendship, and he's directed a variety of youth programs, and at one point had an office, the old Stone House. He has also been on the board at the St. Francis Xavier Action Youth, Action Youth Program, and there we go. Hi, Bill. It's nice to
Hi there, Tony.
So we had been talking a little bit about this slate of candidates we've got, and I thought maybe with your background in the nonprofit world and your legal expertise, probably have a good sense of what we should be looking for in a council candidate. What do you think that would be? What are some of the things that they need to do to get it done for us here?
Well, sometimes when we think of people running for office, and when people run for office, we often are thinking about the big issues, big picture issues. And frequently, an office holder has some occasion to be involved in the big issues, but more often than not, there are more mundane, detailed activities they need to pay attention to. So for a city council member, for example, questions about land use, questions about budget, we go into thinking about those issues with big issues in mind, equity, the underserved, appropriating funds in a rational way. But many times a city council member will also be confronted with the details of governing that can be quite detailed and quite entrenched, that one may not be prepared for in terms of dealing with that. And we may not be prepared for that as voters, to realize that someone needs to be able to navigate what is an ongoing maintenance of a large government, one of the largest governments in the country, that has a lot of services to provide that have to do with water and sewage, transportation, streets, lighting in the streets, on and on and on, that are creating a run rate of demand on the city budget. And we are also looking to use the city budget to address some large issues that are prominent of the day, but that's in the context of having to deal with a run rate of running the city. And so when we think of someone who we're hiring as our representative to be our city council member, I think we want to make sure that whoever that is someone who's able to balance issues we're concerned about that are big picture issues, policy issues, with also being responsible and capable of also handling, negotiating and navigating what can oftentimes be very detailed, mundane. That's one thought that comes to mind. The second thought that comes to mind, again, is many times when we're voting for someone, we think of these big issues, these big policy issues of the day, and criminal justice, education, environment, those types of important issues. But there's also a role for our city council member to be accessible, to deal with constituent issues, constituent issues having to do with fire hydrants or trash collection or parking issues, or lights aren't on in the streets, or something to do with the local playground or park. And so we want to make sure that we're thinking of someone when we're selecting us, our representative, when we're hiring them to represent us, that they have the capacity and skill set and interest in also being accessible to us as a somewhat immediate point of contact. City council member has a much smaller area, geographic area to deal with, and they should be more accessible to us. And so when I think of selecting my city council person, I want someone who has experience and capability and desire to not only deal with the big issues I'm concerned about, but also handle some of the more mundane, detailed, demanding type issues.
I think that makes a lot of sense. We forget how much of a customer service job it also is, besides doing all the legislative work. I'm going to steer us also into education. And Bill, I know you were saying that you had you started a school.
That's correct. I helped found, I helped establish the South Brooklyn Community High School in Red Hook back in the early 1980s. And that was an effort that grew out of a community organizing effort around John Jay High School. And we sought to create a small high school that could help address students who had attendance problems. John Jay in the 70s and 80s had a substantial problem with truancy and attendance, and it was overcrowded. There were a lot more students in the building than it was designed for. And so one of the projects we worked on was creating an alternative high school that could service young people who were having attendance problems, but also demonstrate to the city and to the Board of Ed that these young people with attendance problems could be worked with and could succeed. And so we partnered with Good Shepherd Services, and we partnered with the mayor's office at the time. Mayor Koch was the mayor at the time. And we set up the South Brooklyn Community High School as a program that not only had educators in the building, but had community advocates who were more involved with social services and social work to be matched up with the students. And so their homeroom person wasn't a teacher, it was their counselor advocate who would counsel them, advocate for them, and be a bridge to connect students with other services they needed besides educational services. And the teachers assigned to the school were Board of Ed teachers that were licensed Board of Ed teachers, and they were focused on teaching. And the school was administered by the Good Shepherd Services, so it was administered by a person interested in child development, youth development, rather than purely interested in educational development.
That's interesting, because here we are now so many years later, and we're talking about the same kinds of problems, maybe not specifically in the attendance realm, but the sense of equity in providing more access to things like, now it happens to be broadband with COVID and all sorts of other things. So, so as you're kind of thinking about education in our city now, and you're thinking of where it has been while you were very active in that world, how are you thinking, how do the council candidates and the conversations that we're having around education, how does that all kind of come together for you as a voter?
Well, some of the issues of interest were touched upon in last night's forum. I think Eric did ask each of the candidates a question about education, and some of the candidates were quite experienced with education professionally. Others were quite experienced as consumers, with their children being in need of services in the schools. And so there were some very thoughtful comments last night. Some things that stand out have to do with school safety. And I think the issues around school safety that I addressed back in the 1970s and 1980s aren't that different from the issues today. And I think the view that I had as a community organizer and as an educational advocate was school safety should be coupled with a view of youth development rather than a policing function that was kind of on an enforcement end that was involved with criminal justice or juvenile justice. And I think some of the candidates last night talked about that with this idea of allocating funds, of having school safety be more tied to certainly ensuring security, but be more tied to community resources and a child development focus rather than a criminal justice focus. So I thought that was an interesting issue. A second issue that seemed to be dividing some of the candidates had to do with charter schools. I think some candidates seem to be saying, embracing the idea of charter schools because there's certainly some success stories that often get looked at. And so the idea was expand capacity, embrace charter schools. I think others were concerned about the embracing of charter schools too aggressively might erode public school education in the sense that it becomes a tale of two cities,
Right.
where the charter schools might be absorbing the cream of the crop, so to speak. And I don't mean that in the sense of Stuyvesant High School or something of that sort, but students that might be more easily worked with, and public schools would be left with students who were more challenging to work with. And I think there was some concern about that. So that question of charter schools, I think we're still finding our way, although there are a lot of pros and cons on both sides. But I think those issues are something to think about. And the third thing certainly was budget and having to do with class size. I don't think that's changed. I think that was an issue when I was involved with community organizing around public schools. It's still an important issue to pursue. And a final thing was transitioning back to in-person classes and addressing the impact that the pandemic has had on educational development and being proactive about addressing that. So those issues come to mind when we think about education. And in terms of a city council member who's going to be having a voice on budget, having a perspective that you as a voter would share is important, because they will bring that perspective to decisions being made about budget and budget allocation.
I think that makes a lot of sense. Thanks, Bill. I can't think of anything else to ask you. I was going to say, though, in terms of like education, becomes such a funny topic for the council people, because of course they're working on the council aspect of things, which puts them, the lever that they can pull on education is primarily in the financial realm of things. So so in some regards, there are other ancillary discussions around education. It would take a whole lot of doing on their part to put a big dent in that, just because they're a single council person on a larger body and they have to move a big thing. So when you think of some of the larger, the big picture elements that they're talking about, whether it's education or policing or whatever, what do you look for in a council person in regards to those issues? Like,
Yes.
how do you put that together?
Yeah, and this goes back to my days as a community organizer, and any advice I provide currently to not-for-profits involved in community organizing around issue advocacy is public officials have a platform. Public officials have access to media, access to larger groups of constituents. And so what I'd be looking for is a candidate who is going to be accessible and someone who would be a good listener, because they may not be able to pull the levers at the Board of Ed to affect some change, or the levers with the police department to affect some change other than budget. I know one person mentioned structural change, wanting to have the city council supervise the commissioner of the police department. I don't know if that would ever happen. But what I would look for is someone who would be accessible and open to hearing community concerns, and someone who would be willing to judiciously use their status, their elected office, to support community organizing efforts. Now, I wouldn't want to raise expectations too high, because necessarily elected officials are hesitant to get out in front of things, and because they're subject to the will of the people, and people's wills change. But when I was doing community organizing, it was important for me to speak with state assemblymen, state senators, local congressperson, city council members as elected officials, to engage them in being aware of our community organizing efforts and lending support to them as appropriate, or at least be willing to consider that. And so that's something to think about. I know that there have been in the news recently, the local paper, the Brooklyn paper, had an article about a community organizing effort around a landlord that was reportedly taking a hard line with tenants and renewing leases.
Oh, yeah.
And it seemed as if the current city council member was willing to use his position as an elected official to help with the community organizing effort around addressing that, even though there's not a city council role for him. He's not going to be able to do something at the city council on this, but he was using his prominence, his office, the goodwill of his office, to help with the community organizing effort. So that's something I might look for in a candidate, to see if they'd be accessible in that regard.
That makes
That makes sense? Yeah.
Yeah. Bill, thank you so much. This has been really helpful to help sort out what we're looking at as we're looking at these candidates.
Thanks, Tony. All right.